Hello everyone, today we talk about supplies and siege warfare in the Age of Enlightenment. I'm making this sort of mini introductions to this huge and complex topics so that at some point we can go, as we have already started from last spring, a bit more in depth. Admittedly, what I discussed in those videos was rather the certain doctrinal issues regarding to pitch battles, right? Open field tactics, mostly linear tactics, of course, this time in European warfare. But it's important to dimension, in fact, the broader context of the same. Very simple lines. So, as we have seen already in a recent video, the Age of Enlightenment is notoriously characterized by the effort to rationalize military management and logistics. Right, together with basically every other aspect of warfare, but one that, as we will see now, was increasing, especially in the scale and in the number of armies fielded, and that therefore had to take care of what had in the previous centuries largely been left mostly to the same armies on the field to provide for. That was, in fact, an adequate supply system. In fact, if still in the mid-17th century, the armies once put into the field were largely left to themselves as far as supplies were concerned, and essentially lived at the expense of the country, lived off the land. Now the idea took hold that the government had to plan, in an organized way, supplies for the troops. Right? This is a political issue. We are Clausewitzians. We know that we don't have to specify at every step of the way what is political and what is military, at least when we conceptualize exactly what the military dimension is in subordination to politics, right? But again, the Age of Enlightenment characterized by this rationalization, this increase in concentrated power state, the uniformation of administrative procedures, and or at least the tendency towards that, was all and largely aiming just for these countries to provide with an ever more fluidly trained, equipped, supplied army, and a larger one, as we said, to facilitate, of course, the strategic tasks of the armed forces for the objectives that the state had set. Right, and this was made multiple videos about the 18th century, also from a social point of view, regarding what this entailed, especially for the military, the officers' careers, etc. It's a huge deal, right? It's also a pretty disorderly one. At least it's something which, of course, is institutionally better defined, but still much bigger than what had existed before. So the reason why armies before had not, of course, needed this sort of bureaucracy behind the scenes to make their military administration feel them, is that, of course, it was normal for that specific, in spite of the efforts to improve that, of course, had brought to the state, for armies just to supply themselves in that specific way, because everybody fought like that, and say at large, these powers could not make miracles, or they would have caused it too much in that case. And so in warfare, what was good enough had essentially always provided this substratum, and then you would add other strata according to the capacities of your community. So this need for an organized troop supplies was, of course, in part a military necessity, because the armies in the countryside, becoming more and more numerous, would hardly have, in the 18th century, would have been able to maintain themselves for long without a minimum of logistical organization. This was already evident actually from the second half of the 17th. But there was, at that point, in fact, a quite rapid expansion, a culmination even, during the Wars of Spanish Succession, after which European powers said, look, this immense bloodbath of armies that we can't even, of masses of men, that we can't even properly wield effectively, and that are so concentrated at a given point with enormous logistical strains, etc., something we had to get rid of and trying to fluidify a bit the system, so that after that armies began to be not necessarily less costly, but also probably smaller at some point, before, of course, we were expanding towards the end of the 18th century, aside from the mass reforms stemming from the French Revolution, etc. I will skip the comparative costs, right? Because, of course, armies were getting ever heavier in a at least technological sense. That was especially for artillery, but also actually the coming back of cavalry, etc. These are very important issues. This was the point, in fact, the increasingly decisive importance of firearms, right? It was musketry fire that basically constituted at least the deadliest, effect among the enemy ranks, right? Followed by cold steel, and only after that by artillery, right? Proper. And this meant, of course, that the majority of troops were now musketeers, not blended with pikemen anymore. This had increased the consumption of ammo and gunpowder, which had to be constantly replenished. I think I've never made a bit about linear tactics, but I think people sometimes hang themselves trying to understand, but it's literally the simplest thing ever, both theoretically and practically. In any case, it was very messy, and of course, a lot of warfare was still about minor engagements that just would pave the way to the bigger ones that were, of course, that had been increasing in the last couple of centuries of European history because of these, in fact, political compaction that would immediately require render available, just per se, a greater strategic impact, right? And so the clash of bigger armies. But it was an enormous amount of expenses just for garrisoning the frontier, like having always these reserves ready and throwing down to the meat grinder. Now, the birth of an organized administration, that is, a set of services directly managed and financed by the state with the aim of guaranteeing the supply of the army, also responded, however, to a political need, that is the one of public opinion. You know that the 18th century is a moment of spread of, say, greater importance, first of all, of the third estate, the bourgeoisie, and then there is a spread of literacy, there is a spread of newspapers, there are circles that fundamentally form opinions. These are the people that are increasingly supplying the armies in a practical sense, the merchants, those that had enriched themselves through the colonies, through the ever more intertwined European trade, etc. And so these people were civilians mostly, and even though the majority of the population, of course, was constituted by the peasantry, this estate was ever more important. They would be the ones leading to the revolutions later on, just exploiting the masses as it's right to be, but also, as you know, depleting the ancien regime of its validity largely. But as civilians, there were also, because the peasants worked for them as well, so there was all this problem of the impact that warfare had on countries, because we're in another, aside from the wars fought all over the globe at this point, still the most important ones were basically fought in the old continent, right? And so wherever you fought, of course, you made someone angry locally. That necessity was putting an end to the chaos and devastation as indiscriminate as they had appeared, especially after the peak with the horrors of the 30 Years' War in the previous century, as to transform the war into as civilized and regulated an affair as possible and reduce its impact on social life. Naturally, this was a pious illusion, but it definitely stemmed from the need of rationalizing the military let's say, the military instrument applicability. Von Clausewitz himself, in the following centuries, is pretty clear about the fact that if you want a humanitarian outcome, you have to strike as hard as possible, right? Because any depletion, say fragmentation and the use of force there is simply going to be detrimental to the strategic objective, and actually more civilians are going to die if you don't do as hard as you can at the beginning. Naturally, this is something that, in fact, already in the modernizing and secularizing perspective of the 18th century that we sort of continued in the wake of, ideologically seems like, oh no, because it's no, right? If you really care about human life, the best way is to hit as hard as you can, and of course, in a strictly military sense. That's not to say that politically you shouldn't consider, like, we should, nuke each other, and to think that that's not the point. It's the radical discrimination that you must be able, obviously, to handle it when you, through the Clausewitzian theory, in understanding what's political and what's military, not mixing the two, which is, in fact, what brought to the greatest disasters in the history of mankind, also in the 20th century. But even before that, and so there was naturally, in other words, this complaint of public opinion was also about, let's say, having the means to preserve your own state. In other words, having ever more effective armies that could thus present with a deterrent that would hopefully leave much of the war out of the countries, and or again, Europe had a very particular political and strategic balance that was held precariously, especially since the reemergence of France as the hegemonic continental power in the mid-17th century. So after Westphalen, and so after this whole ideas about how what say also this international regulations should be about. But this balance was, of course, the expression still of regimes that saw war as an aristocratic sport, and that were relatively limited in time. That was still a degree of privatization, etc. But of course, warfare was still increasing, pretty much in violence. So, in spite of the fact that also Europe was becoming larger, so the thing was relatively impacting in that regard. It was evident that the world had to find a more rational order, and of course, avoiding, especially in the compaction of countries, of monarchies as states, the best solution in order to deprive the civilians of the suffering that were added to the sacrifices they were doing, also just to field armies of ever greater power, right? So this ideal was of trying to spare the civilian population from the violence of war was, of course, only partially realized. It was this, again, it's this political background that mostly creates that, because if you look at the Napoleonic era, you realize that sort of this contrast that had existed between the social estates, for example, had been broken. So as a consequence, that entire aristocratic balance that had sort of tried to avoid this broader violence had been broken. And so it's absolutely not true that the more civilized a country, the less destructive it becomes. Actually, it's properly the other way around. But of course, there are historical contingencies for which it seems as if, after the 30 Years' War, and later on with the development of this theoretical, this treatise on politics and war, etc., let's say that there had been a greater attention, to say the least, towards the fate of civilian population, especially in Europe, right, where people were getting ever more civilized and aware also of the risks. Public opinion did count also in policy, in strategy, etc. But still, of course, at the arrival of enemy troops, the populations lived a true nightmare, especially in the countryside, accompanied by violence and requisitions. there's no doubt that compared to the previous age, when this was the usual outcome even of the passage of friendly troops across their own territory, there is no doubt that significant restrictions had reduced the impact of war on civil society, right? And again, the fact that armies were just that violent on friendly territories or allied territories is not like a culturalistic problem. It's simply, the fact that, of course, those communities were much more fragmented than before, also generally less loyal at some point, and that the same armies, the same troops that were hired were often not exactly from the same places, just even institutionally, right? But the general outlook, let's say, of the situation had brought indeed to some awareness and caution regarding to these matters now that things could be done more tightly. So this new philosophy, humanitarian philosophy, could say decisively influenced the way of waging war, also through one aspect of logistics and army supplies, that is the introduction of the concept, if anything, of the warehouse, right? Before starting a campaign, it was no longer enough, in fact, to gather an army and take it into the field. It was also necessary to accumulate vast supplies of food, weapons, and ammunition. Because armies, again, were becoming ever bigger, and they also were part of ever bigger campaigns and fronts, etc. So, that given the second principle of thermodynamics, like it's, you're going to spend much more, even proportionally to the same soldier, if there are more soldiers, right? Because, of course, disorder increases. And so, in order to fix this, right, to try to stem the results, you had to increasingly supply these troops in a way that they wouldn't basically fall apart just more easily than they would at some point do, because an army can't be forever just in the field on campaign anyway. So I made lots of videos telling the truth, explaining the passage, especially from the 17th to the 19th century. So why did the army, say, of the 30 Years' War work the way they did? Why they used winter cantonments? Why things were, let's say, and in the 19th century, in Napoleonic era, basically supply lines are, at least these logistical trains are cut because armies are so big that there is no logistical line that can hold except foraging, like consuming everything you find on the spot, and as a consequence also speeding up the same army march, passing from place to place like a locust, because if they had stayed any longer, they literally didn't have the supply lines, the logistical trains at least, to sustain themselves, if not for something very specific, like, say, artillery or certain type of war horses, etc. That did come still from, of course, warehouses, also in the Napoleonic era. Now, you see, this is somehow counterintuitive, at least if you've never heard of it. It's one of the major deals, right, strategically, logistically, of the Napoleonic era, and the age of mass warfare at that point. In fact, that was very different from what had existed before, in spite of the enormous armies, especially of the War of Spanish Succession, etc. So in the late 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, and then throughout the rest of the same, the strategic capacity of an army increasingly depended on the proximity of the warehouses in which the supplies were kept, and on the possibility of periodically distributing them to the troops, using slow and cumbersome convoys of wagons, requiring robust supplies to avoid any dangers from the enemy. 18th century strategy and tactics as well, including, in fact, the more typical linear one, were deeply influenced by this. The need to cover an ever wider front was not simply due to the decisive power of firearms that could effectively stop frontal cavalry charges, and or at least avoiding the line to break disastrously, considering the entire amount of shock force that the mounted army could be provided with. So, as we were saying before, there was this long attritional confrontation of musketry, infantry. Made lots of videos 6 months ago about these bloodbaths, and the reason, however, was, generally speaking, was to occupy such wide of a front, also based on the on this need, of course, of delivering frontal firepower, etc., but also one not to be outflanked, right? To stretch enemy lines to the point that also maneuvering on the flanks would become very difficult in a tactical sense, and they had mostly to stem from some broader strategic mistake of the enemy. If you look at the concept of oblique line, say, practiced by Frederick the Great, it's not that it stemmed from one day the guy, we must use this, right? We have to do as Epaminondas, which was not actually even what technically, as it's improperly said sometimes, it had happened in 4th century BC Greece. It's another concept of oblique order, but it stemmed from, of course, as always, the training, the moral load of the armies, what they could perform in terms of maneuver, for reasons that had at that point were not tactical, right? The reason of Prussian success in that case, they would just basically skip the tactical side of the story to most extent, because they could maneuver the army so well to arrive in a direction that the enemy was not thinking to be fighting it. And so this is actually an absolute universal principle of warfare, just per se. It could be achieved, but for political, strategical, social reasons that eventually would just made that line null if attacked and overwhelmed in detail from the side. And a lot of, in fact, the fame also of Frederick the Great's accomplishments stems from this, the fact that throughout the 18th century, of course, most armies had remained more or less of the same quality, to the point that they could not quite outmaneuver each other. And this frontal confrontations was very much connected with the need to protect their supply lines. During the same battle, and the generally in campaign, during these confrontations, it could be really long, right, in time as well. This, of course, had always existed to some degree, but of course at this point it was increasing in importance. It was relatively pioneeristic in a logistical sense, because nobody had ever had to field and to supply all these large forces at a time, especially in coordinating them. But this firepower and all the little mechanisms that would make the magic on the battlefield, right? So it goes without saying that the less enterprising generals often took advantage of this concept during the 18th century to avoid taking on too many responsibilities, blaming their sacrifices on the difficulties of supply, until someone began to think that the dependence on the depots was too heavy a constraint, and it was necessary to try to free themselves from it. Right? This was a criticism, just generally speaking, to 18th century warfare that is not entirely fair, but this sense that there was a sort of conservatism that was just mirroring the one of the Ancien regime, and that more violent and revolutionary movements like the ones of the Revolution, in fact, Napoleonic era, would break also in speed and force and in brutality is correct. But at the same time, there would have not been even the latter if that tension had not already formed in the armies. If, generally speaking, there was a very important growth under any point of view throughout the 18th century. Of course, the same Napoleonic era owes much, including the French army, to the royal military traditions, were, as you know, of the first order, to say the least. As a military culture, as a centuries-old military culture, that emphasized that specific order and harshness and necessity even of moving, right, faster. In general, however, in the Enlightenment era, the planning of a campaign depended importantly on the position of the warehouses and the safety of the convoys, much more than on the intrinsic mobility of the troops, which evidently contributed to a certain static nature of the operations. This actually depended on some factors we will see now, but that we shouldn't make too dramatic. I mean, any army in history, when an enemy crumbles and they basically can't move, they go as fast as they can. In many ways, of course, there are some still technical problems, but it's a bit like World War I. I mean, like, people think that, I don't know, the Western Front didn't move, if not with a few kilometers of this massive line from the North Sea to Switzerland just because there were shells or machine guns. This is basically nothing to do with that, right? It's the industrial power of France and Germany that made that balance. In Eastern Europe, the fronts were more mobile. In Africa, in the Middle East, you know what the story is. There are certain trends, but the mobility of armies is not something sort of materialistically and fixedly determined on by even just logistics. Like, you know, of course, talking about technology, which is actually one of the least important factors in warfare, contrarily to what we've been bombarded to think like. But again, there is not like a real structure within which armies in some eras just operated without looking historically instead at the incredible flexibility of armies and their the autonomous transformation and the actual difference in strategies, in operations, just in character of even just from those who commanded them. That sometimes had very often very divergent ideas regarding to this. So we always have a problem in let's say assessing even what real warfare was, especially from a tactical point of view, but even when we look at strategy and we see, as we'll see now, these massive sieges and difficulties in supplying maneuvers. Yes, of course, that influenced the thing, but it was a product just of the political and strategical objectives. Otherwise, things would have worked in a different way. In fact, in other circumstances, they really did. Right? It's definitely a myth that war, in general, would be affected by these sort of intellectualistic or just materialistic issues. It's fought in pretty massive ways, but in ways that still have a broader sense in effort and capacity. But looking at the difficulties, let's consider what late 17th or 18th century Europe was, right, in becoming, by the way, also concerning these general aspects. For example, the poor state of the roads, but above all, the absence of reliable cartography that, in fact, exactly for this pressing needs, military ones would develop dramatically, as you know, in the 18th century. I made a video about that. Had a similar effect. The generals, who were not surrounded by a staff of specialized collaborators, could not develop complex movement orders as would happen from the time of Napoleon. This again was generally functional to the type of warfare was being fought, right? Even the information on the type of ground or crops, etc., that existed in one place was something that armies would do without, still learning it along the way. And this was, generally speaking, true for everyone involved. Of course, what happens in the Napoleonic era is just another level of warfare and of society and politics. In fact, it had to be big different. But at this point, it was already a big deal to field such a huge amount of troops, right? An army moved as a single mass on a single main road, and this obviously made its movements even slower. The enormous quantity of vehicles carrying baggage and supplies, the slowness, and bulk of the artillery convoys they need to stop every few days to build field ovens and bake bread. All this meant that an army could hardly travel in a very speedy way. There are some scholars who say on average an 18th century army marched not more than 10 or 15 kilometers a day. I call BS on that, as a matter of fact. I think that armies march always at the same speed. Then of course that is something like 30 kilometers a day on average. Alright? It's true in the ancient world, in the medieval world, in the modern world, contemporary world, and even if I'm not talking about the single man, that of course can march even much longer than that in a day, but also armies, which is true even for armies, right? I looked at medieval armies that Western Europe could easily make, if they wanted, were prepared for that, even 70 kilometers in a day. Not, of course, to repeat that forever, every single day, but still, it was possible to make the sprints. So it's rather fair to say that, of course, there were some strategical and logistical circumstances in which, of course, armies would march slower, but because they didn't need to hurry in the first place. And this is not a technical problem. In part it is, but it's mostly political. It's mostly administrative. It's mostly something coming from a reason that is not strictly military. And so, as we will see now, the concentration of certain battlefields in quite restricted areas, such as Flanders, made, of course, warfare much more attritional and full of sieges, and so long marches were not even properly a need. But at the same time, armies could be quite speedy, and we made that video about Maurice de Saxe, for example, that showed different sort of strategical circumstances. We made videos also on the 17th century warfare, from Prince Eugene to Siege of Vienna, etc. There was, of course, an influence based, as we've said, on the size of armies. You couldn't concentrate, for example, too many of them in a given area. Right? An army had to move along, as we've seen, a single road and burden the resources of a limited area with all its horses. As a consequence, it couldn't quite exceed organically 50,000 men. And at a time, it was possible to make this larger, but only in the richest country in Europe, that is Flanders, where all the resources of large coalitions were concentrated. Like Louis XIV and his enemies had managed to field armies of 80,000 or even 100,000 men. And so we're talking again about immensely strained logistics. But still, right, this masses logistics is not a branch of the art of war, right? Only strategy is among the two. And of course, the reason why these armies were slower is also because when you have, I don't know, the potential one entire nation or a sum of a coalition of others that fight against the former, like in this case, you have to be very careful about what you do. I mean, there are very pressing strategic and also logistical issues, and everything is always on the edge at every level. But at the same time, there is also a sense of caution, a sense of how do we even coordinate all these forces on the field. As we've seen, that the staff was not quite there in the way we intend modernly, yet at least fully formed. And it was completely normal just to rest on what the standard of warfare had come to be just by itself. It is true that each state maintained, in fact, a much larger number of soldiers under arms in times of war, up to 400,000 in the case of the Sun King, and I made a couple of videos exactly about the army of Louis XIV, and we'll keep talking about that. But of course, the vast majority of these troops were employed in the countless garrisons or in various small armies operating on separate theaters, while governments and war councils attempted to coordinate their objectives and movements at a distance. It is not surprising that under these conditions operations were rarely brilliant and decisive, but again, not because, say, the control on the armies and their effectiveness, their power actually was, as a combination, more or less performing than, given the context, than in other times, right? Everything was, imagine, nobody has ever properly used this many troops. No government has existed with this specific type of armies and firepower and supply needs, etc., for the, say, political and social balance also, not just of your country, but the ones around you. As a consequence, this continuous expansion that is dictated also by the methods of stimulus and so some degree of desperation for competition, for maintaining control, at least of the majority of the European continent and its colonies all around the world, was completely new. And so nobody had ever faced the same challenge. Nobody had ever said, so we say, oh my god, now armies were used so, but this is not really true, right? Armies were used more or less with the same skill that you can find throughout all military history. There is a sort of, again, gold average standard that armies operate with. If you blend everything in, say, the motivation for which the troops are there, the type of, the commander's variety, etc., more or less, right, everything works the way it has to work, right? Here, the world is growing, and as such, it needs more regulation that it didn't have before for the previous system. This is true largely also for the previous times, right? These problems had not emerged suddenly, just not even as we've seen in the 18th century. Like they were something that had been happening already from quite a while to a consistent degree. Another reason why, especially at the beginning of our period, that is between the 17th and the 18th century, the campaigns were slow and inconclusive, is that and this is the most interesting part, because it's a bit like what we were saying before about World War I Western Front, is that the strategic plans continued to be dominated by the role of strongholds and sieges. In the parallel with, again, the First World War, the Western Front specifically, is not much the entrenchments, etc., but the fact that war, as we've seen in a theater like Flanders, for example, had to turn to the, of course, was based on the limited space and the concentration of forces of the major powers around into that sector. It was a great iron arm wrestling competition in which you already know, first of all, that you're fighting there with those enormously concentrated amount of forces from everywhere, and of course, the bigger the armies, as we know, Clausewitzianly, just in fact for military historical experience, the more balanced the odds. And so obviously things are going to be more still until one of the two sides breaks. And even, of course, as we'll see now with the important, say, limitations that siege warfare entailed, right? Because still, even in the century in which effectively artillery began to surpass substantially the concept of stronghold on a tactical operational level, with times in history in which, in fact, this would still oscillate depending on the situation, you could have a major breakdown, but not the collapse of the entire front as such. And so it's still a mixed bag fundamentally. But of course there is a need, as we will see now, towards greater maneuver and actually a greater reliance on pitched battles as opposed to sieges that were considered in this sense just too much of a trap, but that were also a huge deal because individually a strong capturing a stronghold has maybe it wasn't redrawing the European political map, was still entailing a massive amount of men and materiel drawn from half of the continent that still affected dramatically the relation between powers at home and abroad. So also here, evaluate this slowness still as something that did bring some results. Otherwise, they would have not fought. It's that simple. And when you see, in fact, other fronts where there were less forces concentrated, you see more dynamism. You see more maneuvering. Right? Nothing again exceptionally evolutive, let's say, but still, right? And for obvious reasons, because also those theaters were less important strategically. Now, France, which was at the center of all the major European wars during the long reign of Louis XIV, and was so because it was large enough to accommodate vast warehouses that were in turn the product of this enormous demographic and agricultural resources that had allowed the French monarchs just even to concentrate greater resources, centralize power, and fielding, in fact, this monstrous amount of also adequately drilled forces for that matter. They had created probably the first modern national army, right? So the enormous number of strongholds and the limited mobility of the armies meant that the sieges still were capable of absorbing a large part of this immense military power. Hence all those continuous wars in Flanders that, as you know from the Italian wars, had become the preferential theater, right, of which European powers tried at least to solve their disputes. But of course it was not the only place. Many decisive battles were fought to unblock besieged cities. I mean, just yesterday we made yet another video about the one of Vienna, 1683. There's also the beautiful one led by Prince Eugene against the French, and that would also inspire a military observer that would eventually contribute to the formation of Frederick the Great, that is the siege of Turin of 1706. And a general like the Duke of Marlborough, considered among the most enterprising strategists of his time, as you well know, was actually a supporter of a dynamic and aggressive strategic conduct fought in his career, but who fought better had the opportunity of fighting in his career only, but still, because it was an enormous number in that sense, 4 major battles, right, while conducting more than 30 sieges, right. Naturally, not all these sieges entailed let's say the same number of forces employed for, especially those campaigns that culminated in major battles, and that did tend to be, in fact, of course, because of the larger number of armies in the first place, right? It's a very obvious strategic concept. The smaller, let's say, the stronghold can also be more or less large, but at that point, like a smaller stronghold will, even if besieged, will attract less enemies, right? And so at that point, the stronghold, the fortification itself, or even the same field fortifications, can diminish the strategic, let's say, push, right, for that engagement, right? It has to break, even in the smaller sieges, of course, the attempt breaking the same encirclement and giving rise, as it was since ever, like to major pitched battles on regular basis. But obviously, when armies are larger, right, they tend to also overwhelm the stronghold per se, and so those who care about maintaining the stronghold are also pushing for a more direct confrontation than waiting for more. I mean, they could be waiting for whichever reason, including the attrition, etc. But in in general, right, the bigger the armies, the more sensible strategically, in spite of the highest risk to unlock the situation, is the direct confrontation, because that can really settle a lot in just one shot. It's a gamble, but exactly for this, as we know from the second element of the Clausewitzian Trinity, we know that that's basically what strategy is about, right? So it doesn't make sense to come there with such large numbers again, and having an enemy that is of the same and backing down for no specific strategic reason, right? Now, a siege was not a matter that could be handled in a few days, even if Vauban, himself the greatest military engineer in the history of mankind, and also, of course, a general in the army of Louis XIV, who directed, in fact, 53 sieges in his life, and an extraordinary number for sure, together with the chain of stronghold that defended mostly northeastern France, exactly from the coalition armies, had transformed the siege, to all intents and purposes, into a sort of exact science, right? Considerably increasing the chances of success of the siege. This is important because, of course, siege warfare, and this is not the video in which I explained that, but I already made multiple videos on this, had all a specific technicality, right? When you approached an enemy stronghold, aside from the fact that most of them were already documented to some extent, well, you needed that capacity to spot what were the weak points, how you could practically erect the fortifications given the nature of the places, what was more convenient, what was, of course, you had to make a strategic calculation in function of your forces. It was not, again, ever merely a technical or logistical issue. It was always and primarily a strategic one, right? The former had just to serve to the latter's end. But in fact, in this mining, counter-mining, bombardment, counter-bombardment, everything had to be, was evolving and required a very specific sense of what, where the direction, what the trend was, and so where you had to be stronger, where you could be weaker, etc. Now, siege artillery, with its 36 and 48 pound pieces and its immense mortars, moved very slowly. This was a problem. The construction of the siege lines under the direction of the engineers was always a tiring job that mobilized for weeks the soldiers and even civilian diggers forcibly recruited from the surrounding area. So not always skilled military personnel, but there was in fact an ever greater specialization in that field as well. Considered that, in fact, this took a specific time, digging the trenches to arrive under the enemy walls, calculating, in fact, how much firepower could concentrate internally. At this point, the Vauban system prevailing. Naturally, the siege offensive and defensive went in parallel. Commanders of the fortresses made it a point of honor to resist as long as the circumstances, such as breaching defenses or the failure of a relief army to materialize, did not entitle them to negotiate surrender. Right, things could get pretty bloody for the final rank defender, but of course the commanders were regarded also better sheltered, but also just more, curtailed also politically, as far as, the resistance. There was this sense of, again, of aristocratic, negotiation of honor, certain practice for which they wouldn't kill another gentleman, etc. But the crude reality of the sieges had always historically been the same. Like the 18th century is not, say, less forgiving just because of wigs and makeup, etc. These people are withstand like some of the most radically brutal theaters. Like you can imagine, like circumstances, the baths of blood of epochal, biblical scale, to say the least. And so they should be more appreciated, even for this effort of rationalization, because under such strains and pressure, right, maintaining control and order it's a huge deal, right? For example, Louis XIV, of all the times he risked France to be literally overwhelmed, right, and the enemies marching on Paris, he managed to maintain always his cold blood, and he was surrounded by collaborators, politicians, generals that were also largely like him. And these guys managed to handle even the most desperate situations, as we've seen also in that video about, you asked me about the Battle of Malplaquet, effectively, with this cold brutality that still was not daring too much. Well, Napoleon, that also chose pretty daring, kind of impetuous, fiery generals, still had the enemies marching on Paris. And so, of course, it's a very different context, but generally speaking, right, don't depreciate the 18th century's strategic substance, because it was very potent and logical and rational, just as most war really is, right? And aside from the, let's say, the meme of the Age of Reason, of the Enlightenment. On average, very approximately, the siege of an important fortress lasted between 1 and 2 months, and since the arrival of the bad season, the lack of forage, and the terrible state of the roads forced the operations to be suspended and the troops to be housed in winter quarters, it is understandable that the time and resources of an entire campaign were often absorbed just by a handful of sieges. Right, troops kept being, just like in the 17th century, cantoned in the bad season. And yes, there were operations taking place also during that, but it depended on the circumstances. But generally speaking, that was the practice. Because the bad season would slow down even further significantly these enormous machines, and even just the offensive power against these defenses was not that particularly effective. Now, the importance of the warehouses and strongholds, combined with the great cost that the new standing armies represented for the state budget, gave the War of the Age of Enlightenment one of its main characteristics, namely the fact of being a war of maneuver, right? Still fought by generals who preferred to avoid the risks of direct conflict as long as possible. It's relevant, it's important, because resources were, of course, limited still in considering the theaters this wars took place in, and again, depending on which, in North America, armies could, say, move for much wider areas because there was effectively less, right, just like in the colonies in general, whereas in Europe, as we've seen, even just a few hundred of kilometers just made you into the heart of the enemy territory, and you would have found this massive fortifications standing, and of course men, because that's what fortifications serve the purpose of. They're not just by themselves stopping anyone. They need support armies, right? But it's obvious in this sense that still the world was a very big place just to simply, through this system based on supply, very long supply lines, depending on how long you wanted to stretch them, could be too bold after all, right? We are habituated to much different theaters later on, like with great movements, etc. But we're talking about mechanized, the industrial age, and the full industrial age, the second industrial age, depending on when you look at mechanized warfare, etc. We're in a completely different context. That there are much greater amounts of energy that can be easily spent on a regular basis. These are still incredibly primitive wars after all, even again if we want to make the 18th century as this hallmark of modernity. But in practice, right, especially when you look at these technical issues of warfare, you realize that everything was still very very traditional, right? Now, coming back to this aspect of maneuvering, like by skillfully maneuvering one's forces, one tried to place the adversary in an unfavorable position, right, in which he was no longer sure of being able to maintain communications with the depots and reinforce the garrisons of the fortresses in case of need. A well-conducted campaign could thus take place without any major field combat in theory, right, and yet still result in the conquest of large areas from which the enemy was forced to evacuate. This did happen, right? And in these circumstances, the governments were delighted because with the spread of the flintlock musket and the new field artillery, the battles had become frighteningly bloody, right? And as you've seen, public opinion had also a saying about that. It was normal for a quarter or even a third of the forces involved to be lost in a major battle. Right? They were that relentlessly bloody. That tells you how much discipline had just forced his troops just to get themselves butchered, like in front of the enemy, just by following the simple commands and mechanisms they had been brutally imposed, and it worked, right? This was a positive thing after all. I mean, that had very specific strategic relevance. Losing that many men is just to this meat grinder is, of course, a way you still can create a very important imbalance in the broader campaign, right? And so getting to a level of distraction that you want to achieve through those levels of friction. But the warfare had not ever gone too far. Like here we're stereotyping in terms of what could be done, right? In terms of maneuvering. It is true that generals face considerable pressure not to squander armies that had an enormous cost, some in a single day. But at the same time, again, this had always been true in warfare. Like it's not the 18th century that specifically witnesses this. If anything, again, there is probably, in fact, in the Napoleonic era, you see something much bolder. So definitely the balance here is not to be seen in a technical sense or in the actual cost, but rather in the say willingness of the governments to do something specific with those forces. Again, the cost, especially throughout the mid-late 18th century of armies, was increasing specifically, meaning that it was better to have more compact but better supplied armies in a way, capable of greater firepower. Artillery was really increasing dramatically in importance. I made a video about that between the Prussians and the Austrians. And so, say, in spite of the supply lines, just the offensive capacities, the options on the battlefield were widening to a brutal degree. So even Napoleonic warfare was an obvious consequence of that, when you could field ever more forces for political availability. So there was, in the 18th century, we have seen it even through an eye of criticism, that is the Clausewitzian one regarding the treaties that had been written, that must not fully be understood as warfare in the 18th century was thought exactly by those same generals that wrote these treaties as it was written in them, right? These were just mostly ideas, certain vague concepts by men who just couldn't quite apply them in the actual field, and they would actually have a much more practical conduct themselves. This is a problem that this positive theoretical sources to be substantially different from the practice of warfare, which is not something, again, considering that the treaties were written by generals, it's not something you can detach from this aspect, that this was something evidently realized by the same people who wrote, and so who wrote not just to be fully categorical, right? You had to wait the times of von Clausewitz and Jomini to really have that plenitude of theoretical insight and comprehension and capacity of analysis that would, in a sense, mirror the way, say, at least the awareness, the degree of the awareness of what was feasible to replicate on the field and what was instead just something you should be wary of because it could be different. But somebody, definitely in the 18th century, did begin to theorize that the perfect general was the one who managed to defeat the enemy and force him to surrender exclusively through maneuver, without ever having to run the risk of a major battle. This naturally was idealistic. It also doesn't make sense because, again, when you have, of course, you can always, the objective of war in many ways in practice it is to annihilate enemy forces physically, right? Of course, forcing the enemy to compelling the enemy to fulfill your will. But in this sense, you should, of course, have an army that is able, first of all, to do something like outmaneuvering the enemy. And this is never fully applicable. I mean, if you look at Frederick II's, again, oblique order, you do not really see a guy who won a battle by simply getting past the enemy army and cutting the supplies. That didn't happen. He still had to fight a battle and just attacking the enemy essentially at an angle that would take them by surprise, taking them down in detail, and so exploiting that asymmetry that is always the purpose of warfare at the end of the day. This was achieved through positionally, but not because it couldn't be achieved in another way. Through, for example, harassing his supply lines rather than achieving this. This was done even at the same time, and so circumstances were always circumstantial, in fact. But of course, the main strategy is to be very strong, really and literally. This is also what von Clausewitz says, and to punch frontally, because that's the single most effective, or at least positive, objective that you can just feel. Like, if you do so, it's because you know that you have an advantage. You know that you have power. You know that the enemy is weaker, and that even if he opts for the defensive, if you have the capacity of attacking him, it's because you have the chance of breaking him. To the degree you will, in fact, substantiate that attack morally. And so once you do that, it's because you want to literally wipe out the core of the enemy army away, and so winning at that point and literally eliminating whatever there is between you and maybe even the enemy country. So regarding this utopia of just being able to outmaneuver the enemy, it doesn't make any sense. Like, why would the enemy even let himself being outmaneuvered? If that had been the case on a regular basis, say an army would have at that point chosen much better defensive positions to exploit the advantages deriving from them, not even maneuvering at all, which is also not possible to a degree because, of course, the enemy is going to pass you by at that point, but you can now harass his enemy lines. That's also what actually the purpose of fortresses, in fact, really is. So, of course, none of this could be practically achieved, and the best way is just to smash into each other frontally. Now, the most daring generals were, of course, aware of the limits of the theoretical ideals that were, again, not the majority of them, but there was just this tendency of believing certain aspects that were, yes, in a sense, also intellectually put in astray, like certain important military minds, even though warfare was just unforgiving in that regard. But it's not a coincidence, for example, that the most famous commanders of the time, from the French Marshal Turenne to the Duke of Marlborough, stated that a decisive battle is, of course, more advantageous than many sieges, and that we should bring the war to an enemy country without being obsessed with the capture of the fortresses. It makes a lot of sense, right? Because in part, of course, their warfare was a bit dictated by that, as we've seen the same Marlborough did almost like 10 times more sieges than pitched battles, because it's not that he could decide whether to simply bypass strongholds. It's those manned by the enemy, of course, provided with a strategic value that couldn't allow you to simply pass them by if you didn't want to see your army completely cut off from the supply lines. But the idea that, again, once you had in fact destroyed a concentrated enemy force that eventually couldn't be contained by the fortress, and so obviously this speaks of a pitched battle, well, great part of those fortresses would have fallen, would have at least been overrun, and on a general basis, as opposed to just wasting that army only in siege, right? And of course, it was a proportion for that, because you can besiege a certain position while even with the main chunk of your army waiting for the enemy relief force to arrive and to simply attack from another side. And so this was regularly done, right? And so all these, as you understand how it goes in circle as a concept. The way war was fought was concretely the one that was needed in the first place. And these more, however, you must have a clearer view of this, right? If you're reasoning by degrees of how much this is correct, especially when you have to take that decision for real, not just theoretically, right? And so once the enemy army was defeated in the open field, these theorists and generals thought even the strongholds, in fact, would still fall on their own, and therefore seeking the decisive battle was the safest and even most economical way to resolve a campaign, despite a campaign was not merely a matter of economy. Again, that just fit in the background of the motivation political mandate throughout the same campaign. Of course, lots of negotiations were always taking place, as always, but in that regard, it's not about generals fighting wars just because they were considering how much those armies cost, right? The purpose was to annihilate the enemy forces. Only a few generals, however, were willing, but also having the possibility to fully run the risks implicit in such more aggressive philosophy. As we just said, their governments too were not particularly, again, happy of something too bold, let's say. So we have to wait for the wars of King Frederick the Great of Prussia, who did not have to respond meaningfully enough to any Ministry of War Council, because he was, the ruler, for decisive battles to become more frequent and full-blown sieges rare. And consider that Prussia was in that particular situation, even having a soldier monarch, because it was a country that was risking its own existence way more than Austria or France or Russia. And obviously enough, Frederick was just one of his kind, but the sense that he was involved, so heavily involved in his army's leadership, was, of course, the obvious realization that without that, there was no medium between him and literally the fall of his country if these armies had not been victorious, right? And they were much more pressed. Where do you think that Prussian discipline comes from? Of course, there is some background to that, but Prussia was just essentially a depressed country. It didn't have anything. Saint Frederick said, that there were parts of Siberia that were sort of more productive than Prussia. Just sand, he said. Yet right? And moral forces were stimulated dramatically because, again, this country was at some point, as you know, to be overwhelmed, and not even Frederick's intervention was the decisive factor for which he could save his country just per se. There were some miracles, as they were literally called, the ones of the House of Brandenburg, in fact. When the Prussian army was basically incapable of defeating the enemies, if they had not retreated, these are not retreated for their own reasons. And so the great Prussian discipline stems from the fact that if you wanted to beat, and so even the oblique order and all this stuff, from the fact that you needed to train these guys more collectively, giving them more discipline, etc. And hence the quality of the Prussian military, because it was still an emerging country that needed to survive and to affirm itself, and so was more driven. And politically speaking, it had, in relative terms, much greater drive than, say, the French one or the Austrian one, in spite of all the enormous risks involved. And that's why it's so extraordinary, right? But otherwise, most of those directing military operations clung to an outdated, if you want, academic to vision until it was too late, or at least until they didn't realize, just as anyone can make a strategic mistake, that the situation would have needed a greater dynamism, and that in some cases was really not possible to be achieved, right? For example, if you think of the fate of the English general Cornwallis, who during the War of the American Independence locked himself up with his army in the fortress of Yorktown and was then forced to capitulate after a long French-American siege, well, is the clue to how to remain anchored to a vision of war dominated by depots and strongholds. The thing is more complicated for Yorktown, of course, as well, but it still stemmed from that sort of, okay, we will now just settle here and then we will see. And warfare is not just, of course, about strong points, and especially leaving the initiative to the enemy is the single most detrimental thing that you can do, likely. So we have to wait for Napoleon, for everyone to wake up forcefully to the realization that armies at that point were, at least there were some armies that were, as we were saying before, unstoppable, apparently because they were so big that they had cut also supply lines, and they would just sustain living off the land and going as speedily and as searching like the most direct confrontation as they could, exactly because they had, of course, a very different background, and the ancien regimes there were saying, well, but we do not want to change our society like the French one in order to have these armies. Yes, but you have to survive in a way. And so if you look at all the greatest generals, at least the model to which, of course, the armed forces of the various Napoleonic era armies really were redesigned throughout the same period, well, you realize that they had a lot to do with what in fact could not be stopped even with the restoration in terms of political and social and military implications of what the Napoleonic era had been, so much that at the beginning of the First World War, in a sense, this passion for speedy maneuvering and bold actions, etc., was still there philosophically. It's also a myth that World War I generals simply didn't understand that warfare had changed. They knew it very well, just as we were describing it here. One thing is knowing that things have changed, but the ones that will materialize on the battlefield, on campaign, are not just very contingent, of course, but they are also something you can't quite simply calculate, even probabilistically, because they take so many radical turns that you wouldn't expect, even just systemically, that you just can't know how, why a battle like Verdun would fail on the offensive until you have fought it, right? So the sense here is that everybody is good at being a general, apparently, on social, networks, just because, of course, they do not understand any of the difficulties stemming from the enormous, crushing moral burden that, in fact, commanders really have, much more even than the people that die in the front lines. And I really mean it, which is properly an anti, that there is properly a belief ingrained in the opposite direction in the society in which we live. In fact, this speaks of our radical strategical illiteracy at so many levels. But still, right, what happens historically in many ways about this unpredictability is what truly characterizes warfare, because it is the single most unpredictable endeavor in terms of, relatively to what the reality will turn out to be, for what you can control of it in the action, and for the highest risk. So war is, in this sense, probably the best example of how much people's prejudices are never true in so many ways. And the problem is political. That's the interesting part of it. It's not technical, right? It's not some, general screwed up just per se. Is you not doing enough for your country in the first place, because you fundamentally think that, I don't know, war is wrong or bad, and or will solve itself by itself without losses, without. This is obviously the problem that every culture faces at all times, because nobody really shown particularly for that, especially in the later eras. And this is a very relevant context and conclusion that we should always be extremely aware of. We're not it takes forever just to, first of all, understand these issues, let alone trying to command an army, right? And remember that without military history, not even generals can technically understand much of that sometimes, because at least without experience, this is sometimes understood better by military historians than actual military professionals. We did arrive to a point like this. I'm not kidding. Which doesn't mean that, again, I, as a military historian, would be more capable of commanding an army than a trained professional in the military. But the understanding what war fundamentally is, right, in a political sense, in the way it translates itself into the military phenomenon, definitely we, at least the very few military historians that actually study the art of war, are generally more capable even than most officers out there. There is no doubt, right? The idea that if you just participate into a war, you understand it, well, this has no meaning whatsoever. And this is, if it is true for somebody really fighting that war, can imagine it just for the average civilian without this background. So it's definitely frightening in many ways, but it's also really what it is. So yeah, we'll keep talking naturally about these topics, because, as I often say, I can make lots of videos about the tiniest, most minute, details about tactics, formations, battles, whatever. But if one doesn't frame the general picture, consider that Schwerpunkt is at this point some sort of still a beginning of introduction to the actual core of the matter. So I take it in this way. It's useless really to go on to pretend to explain people strange things like most YouTube channels allegedly talking about history of warfare pretend to be doing, right? Saying things like, I don't know, look at this guy who, stormed the bunker even though he was shot at by a machine gun. Yeah, okay, what the hell does that, how does that matter, rather than being a sort of curiosity? What kind of strategic insight will you provide a person with by stating something like that in front of decisions that entail hundreds of thousands of soldiers on a theater, on a campaign? It's very, very difficult to just render people aware of this. This is what I humbly try to do instead, and I hope somewhere this is somehow received. Again, we will hopefully talk soon. Also, I want to come back into something more technical, actually, about 18th century tactics specifically. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.